Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Connor, for the introduction. And I'm hoping that everyone can hear me okay as well. Just going to increase the presentation screen. Well, everybody, thank you very much again for the opportunity to present today and to maybe take you through a project that we have been trialing in Derry city centre and within the heart of the historic walled city, in terms of repurposing some spaces and maybe introducing some temporary meanwhile traffic measures as well. And again, there's a thread here in terms of some of the previous presentations, and particularly colleagues, in relation to the appetite that's out there for us to maybe explore new ways for people to use spaces in ways that they may not have done previously. So to get straight into the presentation then, I guess, we're very aware of the challenges that are facing all our towns and cities nationally and internationally, and this is way before the pandemic in terms of the changing nature of retail and everything. However, March 2020 took a completely different perspective in terms of the pandemic and the lockdown that came with that. So we very much were in a situation of having a global pandemic, but there were very local impacts around that in terms of how that manifested on the ground in relation to our towns and cities. In particular, again, speaking generally, we had government restrictions both, in UK and NI and ROI in relation to lockdown, and that resulted in us having empty streets, closed shops, and less vehicular movements. And again, placing further pressure on town centres and town and city centres in terms of what their function and role actually was and is, and again, creating greater uncertainty for our towns and city centres. From a perspective of Derry, again, lockdown, and like many other towns and cities around this room today and beyond, we all had our unique challenges. And I think that the photographs here that I take you through maybe sum up maybe how the impacts that we were experiencing in April 2020. And these photographs were taken on a Saturday afternoon at around 2:30 in a location that would otherwise have been bustling with people and with cars and movements. And really what we were seeing here were empty streets here in Bishop Street, looking down towards the Diamond and the Guildhall in the distant. Shipquay Street, again, nobody around the streets there. Our historic walls themselves, again, ordinarily would have been bustling with plenty of visitors, and again, empty. The streets leading into the walled city, again, same pattern, and likewise here within the little small streets within the walled city itself. Again, looking into the Diamond and the walls again from a different perspective. So as you can see, and again, these are scenes that weren't unique to us, but equally they were manifesting and playing themselves out globally, as indeed nationally and locally as well. So really the responses that were starting to emerge, and I guess the conversational piece that was happening just generally out there within our sector was, there was a need to promote and protect our towns and city centres, that things needed to happen very quickly in terms of boosting confidence and trying to get people to come out in their towns and cities, but also to try to ensure that businesses survive what was a very challenging period for them. So we were starting to see, and I'm sure people can relate to this, throughout the UK and Republic of Ireland, towns were starting to initiate emergency interventions. So things like pedestrian priority became a very key term, pop-up cycle routes for locations, meanwhile public realm, café culture, and road closures. So we're really starting to see a new conversational piece, a new terminology around, well, what was needed to bring people back into these locations again, and to try to breathe life, and what was a very challenging time, both, I say, during lockdown and immediately after lockdown. Pedestrian priority was one of these terms that we started to see, where basically there was the need for us to maybe rethink, and I say us generally, for people working within planning, regeneration, to rethink, I suppose, the balancing between vehicles and pedestrians, and maybe the need to afford greater levels of space to pedestrians, and in terms of basically, again, creating that vibrancy that was needed, and also confidence, and also addressing things like social distancing. And again, I've just taken you through maybe some examples there where it was happening elsewhere internationally, and again, here examples here in Manchester, whereby, you know, there was streets getting closed off, subtle interventions happening, again, to get people moving around and getting people back into those locations. Café culture was obviously very prominent in terms of the challenges that the hospitality sector were experiencing, and you'll all be very much aware of the conversation there among the hospitality sector, whereby the limits inside was in maybe forcing people to think about what was happening outside. And we see some examples here, the slide on the left-hand side and in the middle, taken in the UK, in terms of starting to utilise the streetscape, the roads, for new public realm space to facilitate café culture. But here we have then the top right photograph in Cork, whereby there was obviously fantastic efforts taken there in terms of how they started to utilise the space, the public realm, through very high quality but very simplistic interventions that started to bring people back out into the streets and to reinvent maybe the towns and city, particularly Cork City, in a different way than previous. Again, cycling provision, you know, we've seen other locations throughout the UK, again, starting to think about, well, you know, people don't want to be travelling in buses, trains. How do we start to move people around safely in addition to pedestrians? So there's very much an emphasis that was happening both nationally and internationally in relation to getting the balance there between cyclists, pedestrians, and getting people back into these towns and city centres. So bringing that all back to our own perspective, well, you know, how did we then respond, and what did we need to do? So very early on, in and around, maybe around April time 2020, there was the establishment of a task force, which was set up to with key stakeholders, which included our town centre management organisation known as City Centre Initiative, CCI, our Chamber of Commerce, university, our planning colleagues, our highways colleagues, and a range of other stakeholders. We try to understand the issues that were unique to both Derry City and Strabane Town, and how did we start to then bring about interventions that might help and assist us going forward. We undertook, through leadership of our CCI, the preparation of a street-by-street survey to identify the challenges and opportunities that were out there, and challenges such as, well, what streets were there pinch points, for example, where there might have been over-proliferation of street furniture and clutter that might not have been able to facilitate social distancing. And at that time, you've got to remember, we were in this unknown period as to how long was this going to last, and what did we need to do, and were these short-term, medium-term, and at that stage, no one knew. But everybody ploughed their efforts into trying to come up with, you know, feasible and practical solutions for basically taking forward proposals. We arrived at a point where we had stakeholder agreement on the types of interventions, and interventions weren't just streetscape and physical regeneration based. They were a coordinated series of interventions which looked at, well, how do we actually support and help businesses as well in what was a very uncertain period, and I can go into that a little bit more detail as I take you through the presentation. So from our perspective, our objectives were very clear in terms of creating temporary, meanwhile interventions to promote pedestrian-friendly streets, new public realm and civic spaces where we could, or enhance those civic spaces that were already there, to assist businesses directly, to promote social distancing, and to bring about and improve business and consumer confidence, and to try to get people back in safely, albeit to our city centre. So whilst those objectives were very ambitious and ones which we were keen to progress, we're also equally mindful of what the challenges were on the right hand side of the screen, and these are just some of the challenges in terms of, you know, legislation. I think it's important maybe to point out that in Northern Ireland, unlike maybe mainland UK or indeed Republic of Ireland, is that local authorities do not have responsibility for highways. So therefore, I say that's actually vested in the Department for Infrastructure Roads, which is a central government agency or department. And we worked very closely with them. And I suppose really the challenge, not just for us, but I guess elsewhere, was that, you know, no one expected the pandemic. No one expected what was going to happen around the pandemic, and the need for us to start looking at creative solutions, and that the highway, the streets, the parking spaces were areas that maybe we needed to look at in terms of creating that space for people to dwell safely, but also promote business activity as well. And again, it was fair to say that we did have a very proactive team within our DFI roads who helped to work around that legislation and to get us to a point of implementation around some of our projects. Funding was the other challenge. We were able to identify what the key issues were, but how did we practically put these on the ground? So we were working at that time with a range of other central government departments to establish where funding might come from and trying to influence how and when that might happen in terms of us walking around the streets, doing those audits and things like that. Changing COVID-19 guidance at the time last year was also a challenge, because we had situations where businesses were opened, businesses were closing, certain, particularly hospitality, and then further lockdowns. So how do you take forward a range of projects when, for example, maybe your target audience that you were maybe looking to promote this to were unable, for a variety of reasons and very genuine reasons, to actually come out and use these spaces? Timescales as well, the urgency and the need for things to happen very quickly, but in the absence of having a clear funding stream and the absence of and also working through the COVID guidance, then again that was proven difficult in terms of how and when you might actually act and do things. Procurement. Again, something which ourselves in the public sector will be very aware of, and how did we ensure that if we were taking projects forward, that we're also able to expedite procurement to make things happen and deliver as quickly as we can. And buy-in was very important as well, ensuring that we had the buy-in of all of our constituents out there, whether it be businesses, our citizens, our elected members, and indeed other key stakeholders. And I can take you into a little bit more detail as I go through the presentation. So the response really continued by virtue of the fact that, working very closely with the central government department, the Department for Communities, who are the statutory organisation in Northern Ireland for urban regeneration, that they were able to identify and come up with a special emergency grant, initially of around £6 million distributed to the 11 councils in Northern Ireland to take forward our own bespoke COVID recovery plans. That funding increased itself to £17 million throughout all of Northern Ireland. And again, it was support for the infrastructure and a range of other business support activities. From a Derry City and Strabane District Council perspective, then obviously we devised a recovery action plan. Our total grant award was in the region of circa £1.6 million. And it's important to say that that was spread across both Derry City, the entirety of Derry City, that was outside of the walled city, Strabane Town, and also our rural district as well. So when you start to look at that in terms of basically the spread, really we were working with relatively small amounts of budget that we needed to make significant impact with. Our COVID recovery plan was based on 4 areas in terms of direct business support, streetscape improvements, marketing and animation. And it was very important for us to present these coordinated as closely as possible, and they've all been very much interrelated. I spoke previously around some of the challenges around timescales. So we identified a business grant programme providing grants of up to £3,000 for individual businesses, or £25,000 for cluster businesses, whereby to get the money directly to where it was needed to get those businesses COVID ready, let's say. And so an example of that would have been, for example, providing financial support to cafes to invest in awnings, chairs, tables outside. So you can see very much how we were trying to make sure that all of these interventions were very much threaded and kept very close and coordinated together. The other element of the programme was around marketing. We were very keen to ensure that we were getting the message out there that when it was safe to do so, and when the towns, when Derry City and Strabane Town and our other commercial districts were safe to come back into, that we were putting a strong emphasis on a marketing campaign around shopping local, spending local, and staying local. And again, that was very successful in getting that message out. And again, animation, we worked on the development of an animation program that, when it was safe to do so, and obviously COVID compliant, that we were putting some activities out into the city centre and within the walled city to, I suppose, make that experience a lot more pleasant and to continue to build confidence among our businesses and consumers, of course. So from a streetscape improvement perspective, we embarked upon preparing a very brief exercise around urban design analysis and framework to understand what could we do within the limitations of our budget. I think it's important to say that, just going back to the previous slide in terms of that total grant award, almost half of that was allocated towards business support grants. So then when you look at the other three components, again, it emphasised that, you know, we had a limited budget, but there was a need for us to do as much as we could with what was left. And it was important for us to get that direct business support to the businesses straight away after lockdown in the summer of 2020. So the framework that we prepared provided us with a strategic overview of the spaces and connections both within Derry City and Strabane town centres, and identify where might we take some of these actions forward. Coming out of that was a number of key projects which we had identified and prioritised, and they were largely environmental improvement schemes, because we had to be mindful of the fact that our budget was limited. We couldn't go in there and do big capital projects involving digging up streets and taking out new pavements and creating that high quality public realm. It just wasn't practical or feasible, because obviously projects like that would require planning. There would be needing to secure significant amounts of funding, procurement. So there was very much the emphasis on meanwhile and temporary. So as part of our overall response, we had a project devised very much and known as the Upper Walled City Streetscape Scheme. Within the analysis that we did, given the fact we were working with a very historic fabric and historic envelope of the heritage context, the walled city itself, our consultants looked at some of the key analysis around the linkages where maybe there was potential to create more pedestrian space, where there maybe was pedestrian vehicular conflict, and how we might alleviate that, and maybe working forward on an incremental approach. One of the projects that they had devised was the project within this upper section of the walled city, and coming through, if you see here, along Ferricky Street, in and around the Diamond and on to Bishop Street, very much like an L-shaped project. And this is maybe I suppose our consultants, permanent vision in terms of bringing out narrowing the traffic from two-way traffic to one-way, and bringing out an extended pavement to create the ability for people to have a little bit more space in what is already a narrow street, and also to maybe promote some outdoor trading activities for some of the hospitality businesses that were located there. And equally in and around the quadrant here of the Diamond, where there was 10 car parking spaces, creating some new public realm and allowing people to sit, dwell, and using high quality furniture. And again, we have along Bishop Street a collection of cafes which fronted onto the street, and maybe how we created extended pavement areas for those businesses to bring their activity out onto the street as well. So this was very much the vision, but we also then needed to understand, well, with the budget, with the timescales, what could we deliver within a very short period of time that could have a meaningful impact, and also maybe change people's relationship with spaces, redefine some of the spaces that people may have seen traditionally as car parking areas, and how you might be able to use them differently. And again, this gives a zoom in terms of the scheme that our architects were putting forward within the context of the document. But again, we had to be realistic in terms of what we could achieve and deliver within the period of time which we had. So the project overview really was, in terms of implementation phases, was essentially first to look at introducing single lane traffic and what was a very narrow two-way street on Ferricky Street under phase one, the removal of on-street parking at the Diamond in the quadrant area. And again, this was an area where parking would be very in high demand, where people would drive around the Diamond, effectively almost like a roundabout traffic junction, trying to find spaces and to get in to those spaces. And the second phase being the installation of parklets on Bishop Street, which just went round the corner from the Diamond to facilitate outdoor trading. So the key considerations for us was really, budget and time, legislation. Whilst legislation was very much, out there, and we needed to work within the legislation, our colleagues at DFI Roads were able to produce guidance which allowed not just ourselves but other local authorities the ability to maybe bring forward projects like this. Consultation and engagement was very important. We were very out there in terms of working with our businesses, our statutory partners. We undertook citizen surveys in terms of engaging with our citizens to gauge their appetite for what they wanted. And we worked with representative groups such as disability organisations to understand their views and try to build in their considerations within, the scheme as well. Traffic flows, loss of parking were key considerations, but we felt that we had the opportunity to come in and work on a trial basis. And the activation and use of spaces was important as well, from the basis that, it wasn't just about putting these projects in situ, but how do we animate those afterwards. So working as a work now towards the end of the presentation now, the upper walled city, this was basically us now starting to implement the scheme where we were taking out one lane of traffic. And as you can see, it wasn't, the aspiration because of the practicalities, of course, for a high quality permanent public realm scheme. This was a temporary, meanwhile trial project about basically bringing the traffic down to one lane and creating opportunities. And you'll see, for example, on the morning of the contractors coming in, where we zoned off with the bollards, the planters, and they try to redefine this space for the temporary period of time. And obviously, this photograph gives us an idea of the implementation of the scheme, where basically we've taken the traffic down to one way and created the extended pavement area. Again, likewise, we have, this is now the area in action in terms of or an activity rather, the outdoor public realm area. And again, very simplistic interventions, but nonetheless important in terms of people being able to sit there, dwell, come out, have their lunch, and feel that they're actually occupying a new space within the city centre. Phase 2 is basically, we're just in the process about to appoint contractors now to take forward the parklet scheme onto Bishop Street. And again, that will help to support and sustain the hospitality businesses located on that section of the street, who we're working very closely with. And just finally now, in conclusion, as we work through the project, I told you already, we've been working through a program of animation of these spaces for the past 12 months. And this culminated in a major event in the beginning of September, known as Cathedral Quarter Weekend, where we closed off a range of other streets in and around the project area and created a pedestrian. We marketed it as a pedestrian friendly weekend, and we brought cafes and street art and other activities out onto the street, and just to basically see how this might work and to gauge the appetite among our citizens and our businesses in the walled city. And this is just some of the photographs now as we work towards the end of the presentation. So really the lessons learned, and in summary is that, through this temporary meanwhile project, and it's important to stress that it is very much still a trial stage. It's there for an 18-month period, and it's been reviewed continuously and adapted if need be. But we've been able to gauge, through our engagement, through the implementation of this project, that there is an appetite for change, and that's been clear in some of the previous presentations, but an incremental one at that. So it's basically working now in terms of identifying is there scope for further change, strategy into action. This is a meanwhile project, but the notion, the concept of taking forward and rebalancing pedestrian priority within the walled city has been embedded in a number of strategies over the past 10 to 15 years. And I think that COVID has given us the opportunity to maybe take a small piece of these maybe suggested proposals, put them on the ground and see if they work or not. The review of legislation, I think that we've been through the journey now. We would all acknowledge maybe, and this isn't just unique to Derry, but maybe nationally and beyond, that there needs to be maybe a review of legislation. And whilst we were able to get guidance out there to assist us to navigate through legislation, maybe a review which looks at how we start to reuse, repurpose and redefine spaces of public realm a lot better. There was very much a can-do approach adopted by all of the partners that we work with. There was positive collaboration across all stakeholders, and consultation, early engagement was key in the delivery of the project. And whilst it was temporary, meanwhile, there was a lot of work had gone into working with all of our stakeholders to secure the buy-in. And I guess the key question now is what next? And I think really what next will be determined by, I suppose, the continued monitoring and evaluation of the scheme, and maybe looking at identifying what opportunities can come from this. So everybody, thanks very much for the opportunity to present to you today. I know I've gone slightly over time, and my apologies for that. And again, here's some other photographs of taken during the event a few weeks ago. And thank you very much.